On June 19, 1941, Soviet archaeologists opened the tomb of the great Turco-Mongol emperor, Tamerlane, who decimated the cities that opposed him and killed millions in the 14th and 15th centuries. Soviet leader Josef Stalin was fascinated with Tamerlane, but he should have had his team obey the warning left by Tamerlane so many centuries before. "Whomsoever opens my tomb shall unleash an invader even more terrible than myself." Less than 2 days later, Adolf Hitler ordered his armies to invade the Soviet Union under the code name Barbarossa, Redbeard, a war which resulted in perhaps 30 million deaths by 1945. Welcome to History on Fleek. Today we shine a light on the dark underbelly of Operation Barbarossa and its connections to the unfathomable depths of the Holocaust. Explore the deranged racial theories that drove the Nazis, the chilling atrocities committed by the notorious Einsatzgruppen, and the colossal military campaign launched by the most elite and battle-hardened forces in the world, the Soviet Holocaust. The word Holocaust is usually reserved for what happened to the Jews of Europe and the USSR under the Nazis. Still, there was another Holocaust, and it happened at the same time, and sometimes at the same places as the mass murder of the Jews and other minorities in Europe. Few people know this, but the first people to be gassed in the chambers at Auschwitz were Soviet prisoners of war. It's estimated that between 3 and 5 million Soviet troops were deliberately killed or worked to death by the Nazis. The war in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe was fought with utter brutality. Nazi racial theories and propaganda caused an explosion of ethnic violence unparalleled in human history. Worse, in some areas like the Baltic states and Ukraine, especially Western Ukraine, old ethnic hatred was unleashed and, in many cases, encouraged by the Germans. At the center of it all were the Jews. Before the extermination camps were begun and completed, the Nazis began their campaign to eradicate the Jewish populations of newly conquered lands in eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and the Western Soviet Union. To do this, they formed units known as Einsatzgruppen, or special action groups. In this case, special action meant mass killing. Many people believe that most of the killing of the Jews was carried out by the notorious Nazi SS. This is partly true, but many perpetrators were reserve policemen and older army reservists. Though many Germans to this day want to believe otherwise, the German army carried out or assisted in mass killings as the front lines moved forward. The infamous massacre at Babi Yar occurred on September 29th and September 30th, 1941. Today, the location is within the city limits of Kyiv, Ukraine, also known as Babin Yar. In 1941, the ravine was some distance from downtown Kyiv, though several small communities were not far away through the pine scrub forest. The Einsatzgruppen moved in within hours of the Germans taking Kyiv and much of the surrounding area after a 7-week battle. With the aid of seized records and public information, as well as knowing that, like in other areas of Europe, the Jews tended to live in separate neighborhoods, the Einsatzgruppen moved in, aided in some cases by anti-Semitic Ukrainians, who were not a small group at the time. 33,771 Jewish people were killed there in 2 days. One of the most disturbing things about the Babi Yar massacre was that off-duty German soldiers, civilian administrators, secretaries, nurses, and many locals witnessed the massacre almost as a grand event. Throughout the war, the area was used for further atrocities against other groups, POWs, suspected partisans, and others. Over 100,000 people were killed in or near Babi Yar until the Nazis were finally driven out of the area in 1943. The Nazis carried out the events at Babi Yar with ruthless efficiency. The victims were rounded up, transported to the ravine, and subjected to mass execution. The massacre at Babi Yar was not an isolated incident, as you will now see. As they learned the most efficient way to kill thousands of people at a time, the Nazis carried out other large massacres like Babi Yar and likely dozens of smaller ones in the Kyiv area. Until the war in Ukraine began in 2022, an organization called Yahad in Unum, founded by a French priest, uncovered dozens of previously unknown massacre sites in Ukraine yearly. One of the Nazis' largest massacres occurred in Latvia for a week between November 30th and December 8th, 1941 in Rumbula Forest, near the Latvian capital of Riga. The Germans chose Rumbula Forest because it was not likely to be seen like what happened at Babi Yar. They were most concerned by word getting back to Germany from soldiers and others stationed in Latvia. At Babi Yar, pictures were taken. The orchestration of the massacre was carried out with calculated precision by the Nazi Einsatzgruppen. Deception and false promises were employed to lure the victims to the killing site. Stripped of their belongings and dignity, the Jews were forced to march to the pits dug in the forest in small groups. More than 25,000 Jewish men and women were killed in the forest. Sadly, due mainly to political questions within the old Soviet Union, many people in the West know nothing of the Rumbla massacre. The attack. Operation Barbarossa was the largest land campaign in human history. Over 3 million German troops and their allies stormed across the borders that Stalin and Hitler personally had agreed upon in their secret talks of late August 1939. For a time, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt believed Hitler and Stalin might become military allies, which would have been an even bigger nightmare than what World War II became. Still, Hitler had to have the Soviet Union. More than anything else, with the possible exception of his hatred of the Jews, Hitler had based his rise to power on the German people gaining Lebensraum, or living space, in the Soviet Union, at least to the line of the Ural Mountains, some 2,000 miles from Berlin. The German leader also believed that the Slavic people of Eastern Europe and Russia were racially inferior to the Germans, and that, as the stronger and more advanced people, the Germans had the right to take what they deserved and settle Western Russia, Ukraine, and the oil-rich Caucasus, with German farmers and colonies. In addition to the over 3 million soldiers at the start of the battle, the German force consisted of over 6,000 tanks and other armored fighting vehicles, perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 aircraft of all kind, an estimated 8,000 to 20,000 artillery pieces, nearly 20,000 mortars, and over 500,000 horses, and the same number of trucks. Soviet numbers are harder to come by for many reasons. Still, it's estimated that on June 22nd, the Red Army had just under 3 million men on the western border of Soviet territory, which included eastern Poland and Latvia, 11,000 tanks, and perhaps 10,000 planes. It sounds like a lot, and it was, but the Soviets had several significant problems. Many of their troops were green and relatively untrained. While some of their ranks were newer models like the KV-1, KV-2, and the T-34, most Soviet tanks in June 1941 were too large, obsolete, slow, or small and poorly armored. The same went for the Red Army Air Force, which the German Luftwaffe destroyed mainly on the ground in the first hours of the invasion, or the sky shortly thereafter. Of course, Soviet factories replaced many of these losses, and when they did, at least through 1941, they too were destroyed. What's worse, Stalin, perhaps the most suspicious man in world history, seemed to have believed Hitler would honor the non-aggression pact they signed in the summer of 1939, even after German troops were reported crossing the more than 1,200-mile-long border in many places. The Soviet leader either disbelieved his officers or was frozen into an inaction that lasted for about 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, the Germans drove miles and miles into Soviet territory. Though the numbers were about the same, attackers have an advantage. They know where they're going. The defenders have to guess. So the Germans focused their attacks on focused areas, broke through Soviet lines, and fanned out behind Soviet troops, manning the front in other areas. Making things even worse for the Soviets was that most of their troops were green. Worse still, paranoid Stalin had killed off or jailed many of his officers in the Great Purge of the Red Army in 1937. Those who were left were either too afraid to take the initiative and retreat, or had no idea whatsoever how to lead men in battle. On the other hand, at the time, the German army was the best led and most experienced in the world. One thing the Soviets had more of was men, and the Germans severely underestimated the number of men that the Red Army had and could call up for duty. In June 1941, about 500,000 Soviet troops were in the Far East on the border with the Japanese-held northern China. The Soviets and the Japanese fought 2 large battles in 1938 on the plains of Mongolia. While the Soviets defeated the Japanese, Stalin was worried that Hitler's Japanese allies would invade his resource-rich eastern territories while he moved on towards Moscow. It was not until the Japanese attack on the U.S. base at Pearl Harbor that Stalin ordered these men to fight the Germans, and when he did, the German advance was halted before Moscow in December and even pushed back. The Soviet counteroffensive of December marks the end of Operation Barbarossa. The next year, the Germans would attack again, but in the south. From June to December, the Germans and their allies, Finland, Hungary, Italy, and Romania, lost about 1 million men, killed, wounded, and missing. About 3,000 aircraft and nearly the same number of tanks were destroyed. The Soviets lost a staggering number of men and equipment. Nearly 600,000 were killed in action. 300,000 dead through disease, hunger, and German atrocities, and nearly 3 million men were captured or missing. The number of tanks and planes also boggles the mind: 20,000 aircraft and 20,000 armored vehicles. Tamerlane's curse was real. This has been History on Fleek, and we'll see you next time.